There is a peculiar form of suffering that masquerades as virtue, the kind that teaches us to endure what silently erodes us, all in the name of being good. From a very early age, we are conditioned to equate our worth with our ability to bear discomfort, be polite, be agreeable, be the bigger person, turn the other cheek. And so we become experts at swallowing our pain, denying our needs, and wearing masks that smile through agony. What begins as a noble act of patience, however, often curdles into self-abandonment. The psyche, in its quiet wisdom, does not forget what the mouth refuses to speak. Every "it's fine" we utter when it's not. Every forced nod of agreement when our soul screams, "No," accumulates like sediment in the unconscious. The outer world sees serenity, but inside a silent storm brews. It's a slow erosion of the self, subtle, invisible, yet devastating. True strength has been so deeply confused with tolerance that many walk through life mistaking their suppression for resilience. But resilience is not about how much you can bear before breaking. It is about recognizing when bearing it becomes a betrayal of the self. There is a pivotal moment, often brought on by emotional exhaustion or a sudden crisis, where something inside us rises with ancient clarity and whispers, "No more." And in that whisper lies the first breath of true freedom. A woman, let's call her Elena, once sat in my presence recounting 22 years of marriage to a man who loved her only in convenience. He praised her when she catered, ignored her when she needed, and controlled her through subtle disapproval. She wore this life like a well-fitted coat, convincing herself that endurance was loyalty, that tolerance was love, that suffering in silence was her feminine nobility. But the body keeps score, and her back, her literal backbone, began to ache without relief. No scans showed anything, until one night, sitting alone after dinner while he retreated into his usual indifference, she placed her fork down and said aloud to an empty room, "No more." That sentence, barely audible, cracked open a dam within her, not of rage, but of remembrance of her forgotten self. She did not leave that night, she did not scream, but something fundamental shifted. She stopped explaining her pain to someone who was invested in denying it. She stopped trying to earn the bare minimum. She stopped measuring her goodness by how much mistreatment she could absorb. And in doing so, she redefined strength, not as silence in the face of suffering, but as truth in the face of fear. We must understand tolerance that harms the soul is not compassion, is unconscious self-punishment. Often, the roots of this pattern stretch deep into childhood, where love was given conditionally or not at all, where emotional neglect was normalized and anger was unsafe. We internalize these early environments and unconsciously seek to replicate them in adult relationships, not because they're good for us, but because they are familiar. What we call love is often a repetition of old wounds, and what we call strength is often a disguise for self-abandonment. So we endure. We say yes when every fiber of our being pleads no. We keep toxic people in our lives under the guise of forgiveness. We stay silent to avoid drama. And in doing so, we forget ourselves. But the unconscious does not forget. And if we do not heed its whispers, it will speak through symptoms, through depression, through inexplicable fatigue, through illness. It just appears as unhealthy. Sometimes after talking to a friend who has the same problem. If we do not heed its whispers, it will speak through symptoms, through depression, through inexplicable fatigue, through illness. The body becomes the mouthpiece for the truths the lips dare not speak. And yet, when that sacred "no more" emerges from within, it does not come to destroy, it comes to awaken. It is the soul asserting its right to exist, and with it comes an unfamiliar form of self-love. Not the pampering kind, not the fleeting affirmations of worth, but a fierce and grounded love that knows its own boundaries. A love that does not beg for crumbs or barter for belonging. A love that no longer ties its value to being indispensable to others. This awakening can be disorienting. For those around you who have grown accustomed to your compliance it may seem like rebellion. To those who benefited from your silence, it may seem like hostility, but it is neither. It is restoration. You are not becoming unkind, you are becoming whole. Let me tell you about a young man named Isam. In his friend group, he was always the therapist, the one everyone came to with their burdens, but who had no space to speak his own. His kindness was taken as infinite, his time always assumed available, and he fed off the illusion that being needed meant being loved, until one day, after consoling a friend who never asked how he was doing, he broke down. Alone, in the shower. This is the time to feel love and to feel abundance. It hit him. Not one person had asked him sincerely how his heart was doing in years. He had built his identity around being useful, thinking it was strength. But that day he realized it had cost him intimacy. His strength was a wall. The day he began saying no, not out of spite, but self-respect, he lost some people. But he found something far more important. People who saw him, not just his usefulness. People who respected the space he needed. And more importantly, he saw himself, not as a role, not as a function, but as a being worthy of care. This transformation does not come without grief. We grieve the years we spent betraying ourselves. We grieve the connections that were never mutual. We grieve the masks we wore to be loved. But on the other side of this grief is liberation. And in that liberation, we discover that true strength was never about how much we could carry. It was about how willing we were to set it down. Saying no more is not an act of war. It is an act of healing. It is the moment when the self, long exiled to the corners of your own life, returns home. And in that return, you realize something breathtaking. You were never weak. You were just tired of pretending strength meant silence. The moment you stop mistaking tolerance for virtue is the moment you begin to live in alignment. And in that alignment, love, not the kind you earn, but the kind you are, finally finds a place to root. There's a certain kind of love that seems like love, but isn't. It flatters, it rewards, it clings, but only when you play the part. Only when you shrink your truth to fit the expectations of another. And so, without knowing it, many spend years trading authenticity for approval. What we call love becomes a negotiation, a performance, a pleasing. But there comes a time, a holy rupture, when the soul begins to hunger for something deeper than praise. It no longer tolerates affection that comes with strings, validation that demands conformity, connection that exists only as long as you're easy to digest. That is the moment when something ancient and sovereign inside of you begins to speak. And what it says again and again is this: no more. This is not a rejection of love. It is a refusal of its imitation. It is a refusal to keep drinking from the cup of scarcity and calling it wine. From the earliest days of life, most of us were trained to equate love with performance. A child cries and is told, "Stop that, be good." A child rebels and is punished, not just with consequence, but with coldness. Approval is offered like a currency, given when we behave, withheld when we don't. And so we internalize a message so deeply, we forget it's not truth. If I want to be loved, I must earn it, and so begins the split. We fracture ourselves. We exile the parts that feel too much, our anger, our longing, our grief, our authenticity. And we polish what remains into something digestible. We call this our personality, but often it is just our survival mask. Beneath it, the real self waits. As we grow older, this inner fracture continues to express itself in our relationships. We chase people who offer affection but never security. We are magnetized to those who make us feel almost good enough. Why? Because the psyche does not seek happiness. It seeks familiarity. It seeks the repetition of early wounds, not out of masochism, but out of a deeper, unconscious desire to finally master what once overwhelmed us. We choose partners, friends, even mentors who mirror our parents' emotional availability or lack of it, not because we're broken, but because we are trying to complete the story. And still, we tell ourselves this is love. But it is not love when you have to become less to receive more. It is not love when you are tolerated, not cherished. It is not love when it rewards silence and punishes honesty. That is a transaction. That is a performance. And the soul eventually grows weary of playing a role in someone else's story. There is a young woman I once met, brilliant and deeply feeling, who always found herself in relationships where she had to fight to be seen. Her partners were distant, distracted, always a little out of reach. But if you find yourself distant, distracted, always a little out of reach, she bend herself to be easy, fun, cool, never too demanding. And each time she expressed her needs, she'd be met with discomfort or withdrawal. Still, she stayed. Why? Because a part of her believed that needing too much would make her unlovable. This belief didn't come from her lovers. It came from childhood, where she had learned long ago that attention was conditional, that love was fragile, and that needing too much would make it disappear. But one day, after another argument in which she was told she was too emotional, she didn't cry, she didn't scream, she just went quiet. Not in defeat, but in clarity. Something clicked. She realized that the ache she kept trying to fill was not caused by her partners. It was already inside her. The love she was starving for could not be filled externally because it was never truly given when she was young. And suddenly, chasing it outside no longer made sense. That was the day she said, "No more." She walked away not just from him, but from the version of herself who believed love had to be earned through self-erasure. She stopped trying to be small enough to be loved. She stopped mistaking emotional scraps for nourishment. And in that choice, she entered a new terrain, not of loneliness. The moment we stop settling for conditional love, the world shifts. Not because others change, but because we do. We stop searching for someone to rescue us from our emptiness and start tending to that emptiness ourselves. We begin to mother our own inner child, to father our own sense of safety. And in that process, we no longer seek relationships that mirror our wounds. We seek those that reflect our growth. This transition is not easy. It is often lonely. When you stop settling, you may find that many connections fall away. Those who only knew how to love the version of you that performed may no longer recognize you. They may accuse you of being distant, difficult, selfish. But you are not selfish for wanting love without condition. You are not difficult for being whole. To love from a place of authenticity requires immense courage. It means risking rejection for the sake of truth. It means being willing to lose people rather than lose yourself. It means holding your worth as non-negotiable even when the world tells you to compromise. And slowly, something miraculous begins to happen. You start attracting people who meet you where you are, not where you pretend to be. You start feeling safe enough to be seen in your totality, flaws, edges, shadows, and all. You begin to realize that love is not something you need to chase. It is something you create from the inside out and then recognize in others who have done the same. You no longer measure love by how much you're needed. You no longer mistake intensity for intimacy. You no longer cling to those who only open the door halfway. You stop knocking on doors that require you to shrink before entering. And the most beautiful thing of all, you finally feel at home in your own presence. You become the one you were seeking. It is no longer a performance. It becomes a recognition, a resonance, a return, not to someone else, but to yourself. There comes a moment in every inner journey when the pain we once ran from turns to face us, not as an enemy, but as a teacher. For much of our lives, we see our wounds as signs of weakness, blemishes to hide, mistakes to regret, shameful evidence of our failure to protect ourselves. We try to forget them, bury them beneath distractions, or rewrite them into prettier stories, but No matter how far we flee, they follow, because they are not just scars on the surface. They are the very maps etched into our soul, pointing us home. Most people believe healing means getting rid of pain. They imagine it as a return to who they were before the heartbreak, before the betrayal, before the silence that echoed louder than any scream. But the truth is far more paradoxical and far more sacred. Healing does not erase what hurt you. It transforms how you carry it. It rewrites the meaning of what once broke you. And it reveals that what you thought was the end of your story was actually the door to your becoming. There is a woman, let us call her Amina, who spent most of her adult life repeating the same painful pattern. No matter how successful she became, no matter how many achievements filled her resume, her relationships felt hollow. Time after time, she found herself invisible in love, choosing people who withheld warmth, affection, and presence. She would try harder, give more, become easier to love, and each time she was left wondering, what is wrong with me? It wasn't until a particularly cold goodbye that something shifted. There were no raised voices, no dramatic exits, just a quiet departure, a message read and unanswered, but in that emptiness something inside her stirred. Not desperation, but clarity. She sat alone, remembering how this feeling was not new. She had felt it before, years ago, as a child waiting for a parent who never quite returned emotionally. She realized then that she wasn't just grieving this man's absence, she was grieving a pattern, a wound that had traveled with her for decades, quietly shaping her choices, her expectations, and her sense of worth. This realization was the beginning of her rebirth, not because the pain disappeared, but because she no longer feared it. She began to speak with it, to write it down, to sit with it in silence, and slowly, what once felt like a curse became a mirror. It showed her where she had abandoned herself to feel chosen, where she had silenced her needs to remain acceptable, where she had mistaken anxiety for love because chaos was what felt familiar. This is the moment when the psyche begins to alchemize suffering into wisdom, not in theory, but in lived experience. When the wound is no longer the thing you avoid, but the thing you integrate. Most people do not understand that wounds do not exist to punish you, they exist to awaken you. They are the places where your soul is most alive, most raw, and most capable of transformation. The wound is the crack in the ego's mask. It is the rupture through which truth enters. But this process requires courage, because it is far easier to blame others, to say they hurt me, and stop there. But pain is never just about what happened. It's about what it touched in you, what it reactivated. What it touched in you, what it reactivated, what it mirrored. The external event may be real, but the internal reaction is the deeper story. And that's where your power lies. A man I once knew, call him Joseph, grew up with a father who only acknowledged success. Emotion was weakness. Failure was punished with silence. As an adult, Joseph became a perfectionist. He climbed ladders, collected awards, but no achievement ever soothed the emptiness inside. When he lost his job in a sudden restructuring, he fell into a depression so deep he didn't recognize himself. He believed his life had ended, but in that darkness, a deeper voice began to speak. For the first time, without accolades to prop up his identity, he was forced to face the deeper wound. His belief that he was only lovable when he succeeded. And underneath that, a child who had been longing to be held, not for what he did, but for who he was. Joseph began therapy. He took long walks without a destination. He started drawing again, something he hadn't done since he was 10. The depression didn't lift overnight, but it softened. Because he was no longer running from his wound, he was listening to it. And in that listening, the wound became a doorway. This is what so few people understand. Your deepest pain is often your deepest purpose in disguise. The one who was abandoned learns to be a home to others. The one who was silenced becomes a voice for the voiceless. The one who was unseen learns to see with the kind of eyes that heal. But this transformation doesn't happen by bypassing the pain. It happens by walking through it, by holding it with reverence like an ancient book filled with truth written in invisible ink. The ink becomes legible only when illuminated by the light of self-awareness, by the self-evident pain that filters through self-awareness. Our culture teaches us to rush through healing, to fix it, to get over it. But the soul has no timeline. It doesn't care about your schedule or your goals. It cares about wholeness, about integration. It wants all of you, not just the parts you find acceptable, but the ones you've hidden even from yourself. When you begin to see your wounds as wisdom, everything changes. You stop envying those who seem untouched by suffering, and instead you admire those who have been to the depths and returned with light. You recognize that your pain is not your identity, it is your initiation. There is a kind of beauty that can only be born in the aftermath of heartbreak, a strength that arises not from never having fallen, but from rising again and again with a heart that still chooses to open. This is not naive optimism, it is sacred realism. It is the knowing that life will break you, and yet the soul cannot be destroyed, only transformed. And so, when the next wound comes, and it will, you no longer ask, why me? You ask, what is this asking me to see? And in that question, you reclaim your power. Not the power to avoid pain, but the power to transform it into wisdom. Because it is through our wounds that we remember who we are. Not the mask, not the role, but the raw, radiant essence of our being. And that is where healing lives. Not in forgetting the wound, but in finally understanding what it came to teach. There is a form of exhaustion that no amount of sleep can cure. It lives not in the muscles, but in the soul. It is the weariness of a life spent, scattering one's energy into places it was never meant to go, into conversations that go in circles, into relationships that ask you to shrink, into duties that feel more like debts than offering. It is the heaviness that settles in the bones when one has lived too long in the service of being accepted rather than being whole. And yet this kind of fatigue is invisible. From the outside, you appear functional, even successful. You respond to messages quickly. You show up for every obligation. You are there for everyone. But inside, the flame that once lit your eyes has dimmed. You have confused constant availability with love. You have mistaken self-sacrifice for virtue. You have traded your sacred energy for approval that never really fills the void. What many do not realize is that energy, our inner fire, is not infinite. It must be tended, protected, restored. Every time you say yes when your soul says no, you fracture. Every time you give when you are already empty, you wound yourself. Not because giving is wrong, but because giving without boundaries is betrayal disguised as kindness. What is that? Giving with honor without boundaries is betrayal disguised as kindness. We live in a world that celebrates hustle and praises the one who never rests. But beneath this is a quiet epidemic, the loss of the self through energetic leakage. Not dramatic breakdowns, but the slow erosion of joy, presence, and clarity. And yet the moment you whisper no more is the moment you begin to return. It does not always begin with a grand decision. Often it starts with silence. You stop responding to what drains you. You no longer offer explanations to people committed to misunderstanding you. You feel the pull to be nice, to be understood, but you resist. Not because you are unkind, but because you have finally remembered that your life is not a performance, it is a ritual. There is a man, call him Elias, who once lived for the praise of others. Every invitation he accepted, every favor he fulfilled, every call he answered, even when his chest was tight and his mind was screaming for space, he was loved, yes, but only in the way a tool is loved, for its usefulness. Then one evening he arrived home, sat in his car, and cried, not because something tragic had happened, but because nothing had changed except the growing realization that he was not living. He was maintaining, managing, surviving. That night, for the first time in years, he turned his phone off. He lit a candle. He sat in the dark with only his breath. And in that stillness, he heard a voice, soft, ancient, unmistakable. Come back to me. That voice was his own. He began to reclaim his energy in small ways. He said no without apology. He canceled things without guilt. He rested without asking permission. At first, it felt like rebellion, but slowly it began to feel like reverence. This is the awakening many never reach, not because it is unreachable, but because it is unfamiliar. We are taught to define our value by what we offer others. So when we begin to choose ourselves, shame rises like a phantom. But that shame is not truth. It is the echo of an old belief that says you must earn your right to exist. But your energy is not a debt to be paid. It is a flame to be protected. When you begin to guard your energy, you notice things you never had space to notice before. You feel the difference between presence and performance. You sense which people feed your soul and which merely feed off it. You discern which commitments are aligned with your truth and which are masks you've outgrown. And in that discernment, you begin to design a new life, not based on obligation, but on resonance. And whatever it is, you get better and far more sustainably when you are in alignment with your truth and which are masks you've outgrown. And in that discernment, you begin to design a new life, not based on obligation, but on resonance. And with honor, which ones are yours. You also begin to notice your own patterns, the ways you've unconsciously drained yourself. Maybe you've clung to relationships out of fear of being alone. Maybe you've overextended yourself to avoid feeling unworthy. Maybe you've filled every silence because you were afraid of what it might reveal. But now you make a different choice. You do not fill the silence. You listen to it. You do not chase closure. You choose peace. You do not beg to be chosen. You choose yourself. This reclamation is not selfish. It is sacred. For when you protect your energy, you become more available to life. Not in the scattered, frantic way, but in the rooted, intentional way. Your presence deepens. Your joy becomes less fragile. Your creativity begins to rise again, not forced, but flowing. You laugh, not because you should, but because something within you has space to bloom. Consider the earth. When overfarmed, it becomes barren, but when left to rest, it regenerates. The same is true for the psyche. Your energy is soil. If you allow everyone to plant within it without care, nothing of beauty can grow. But when you choose to tend it, when you decide who and what is worthy of your attention, then you begin to flourish. This journey is not about isolation. It is about clarity. It is about being self-aware. You are no longer available for what dims your light. You are no longer performing for love. You are no longer abandoning yourself in the name of being accepted. And yet, this does not make you cold. It makes you honest. And there is no love more powerful than love rooted in honesty. The paradox is this: when you reclaim your energy, you become more giving, not in volume, but in purity. You give from a full cup. Your yes is wholehearted. Your presence is real. You become a sanctuary, not a service station. And the people who are meant for you will not resent your boundaries. They will rise to meet them. In the end, reclaiming your energy is the most radical act of self-love. It is the moment you remember that you were never here to burn yourself out to keep others warm. You were here to burn brightly, to live lit from within. And everything that asks you to dim that flame is not a test of your goodness, but a reminder of your power. When you honor your energy, you honor life itself, because your energy is not separate from who you are. It is the very essence of your being. And to live from that essence, to protect it, to nourish it, is not only your right, it is your responsibility.